Bruce Miller,
Here.
Kirk Martin,
Here.
Craig R. Curry,
Here.
Patricia Griffin, Carl Hopkins, Karen Kahn,
Here.
Jim Wilson.
Here.
All right, thank you. Do we have any changes to the agenda?
No changes, Mr. Chair.
All right. This brings us to public comment. Any of the member of the public may address the commission. Do we have any speaker slips?
No slips?
Public? Okay. Very good. Thank you. Notices on Thursday, August 14th, 2014, 5:30 p.m. The Airport Commission Secretary duly posted this agenda. And minutes. We have a recommendation to waive the reading and approve.
So recommended.
Second?
All right, all in favor of approving the minutes as presented?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The minutes approved. Consent calendar, 4 items, lease agreement with Rama Masonry, an agreement both with, or 2 agreements, Atlantic and Signature for the fuel flowage to commercial carriers, and a property management report. Any changes to the consent calendar?
No changes.
Motion?
I motion we pass the consent calendar as stated.
Second.
All right, all in favor of the consent calendar as presented?
Aye.
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 Opposed? Consent carries. Thank you. And that brings us to liaison reports. I believe we have our City of Santa Barbara liaison, Councilmember Frank Hotchkiss. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening, thank you. First, I wanted to say that the council unanimously approved the DRI sale, and I know that there wasn't unanimity, I think, here, and so I thought we'd explain a little bit about why. First, it's a world-renowned organization. I think you recognize that, of significant value. And secondly, on a more mundane level, it meant that to develop the other parcels that we have out here would have taken probably $25 million in bonds or loans of some sort. This precluded that difficulty. So in a sense, we've sort of killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Probably not the right phrase to use at the airport, but you understand, I hope, and will appreciate why we did it. Secondly, I wanted to tell you that we continue to be a successful organization in the sense that the TOT continues to climb. Let's hope that continues, but frankly, that's way beyond our control. We must be doing something right, if nothing wrong. So let's, as I said, I hope that continues. And finally, an update on the district versus at-large elections and where we stand. We have been officially served and sued by the group led by the attorney, Barry Capello. They, however, have not or have refused to share their findings insofar as racial polarization, although they obviously think they found it. We are independently looking at that allegation because that's the only allegation upon which this whole suit could stand. And we suspect that what our consultant will come back will be with as Woody Allen would have said, a definite maybe, which probably means that, we've got to look at it that way, take it in a worst case scenario, and eventually it well may go to the ballot, be left up to the voters. But the real findings of our consultant are important because should the voters reject district elections at the ballot, it gives us the suit would continue, by the way, but it gives us a much stronger legal position to argue from before the court to maintain, as the voters requested, district elections. That again, or maintain general elections. That again is on the assumption that district elections will not be approved. So I hope that was a little bit clearer than it sounded to me when I was saying it, but if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. If not, thank you very much.
Questions? All right, thanks for joining us. And I guess that, in the absence of our Goleta liaison, that brings us to administrative reports. Item 8, we, I believe, have a presentation on the power purchase agreement.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Tonight, Jeff McKee, Maintenance Superintendent, will provide the information on the power purchase agreement. Jeff?
Commissioners, as Hazel said, I'm Jeff McKee, the Maintenance Superintendent for the airport, and I'm here to talk about a little bit the solar photovoltaic project and the power purchase agreement associated with that project. As far as an outline, I'll give you a little background on the project. We talked about it a couple of meetings ago. I'll introduce Robin Park, who's a senior manager for SunEdison, and he'll talk a little bit about SunEdison, tell you a little bit about the company and the proposal that they've made. And then I'll be back to talk about the power purchase agreement terms and a little bit of financial analysis behind the project, and then ask for your recommendation that council approve and authorize the airport director to execute the power purchase agreement with SunEdison. As background, City Council directed staff to explore ways to kind of reduce the increased carbon footprint associated with the new terminal building. Obviously, we went from a much smaller, kind of antiquated building to a larger energy-using building. The escalators and elevators and all those systems use a lot of power, so we do use a considerable amount more power. So council wanted us to look at ways to offset those carbon emissions. The solar voltaic canopies in the long-term parking lot were kind of the direction that we chose. They'll supply renewable energy to the airline terminal directly. And so the means to get that done we chose was a power purchase agreement, which a third party, SunEdison, comes in and develops, builds, permits, operates, maintains the solar PV collection system, and we buy all the power produced by the system. So that's what the power purchase agreement does. Request for proposal were issued in February 2014. That was the second request for proposals that we had done. One was done back in 2010 or 11, I think, and we didn't have any successful proposals at that time. This go around, we received 8 proposals from 8 firms. Each proposal was evaluated for economic value, the proposed system, the experience of the proposer, and the schedule that they outlined. So there were 3 top proposers that were invited for interview, and SunEdison was selected. I guess I'll go ahead and have Robin come up and talk a little bit about SunEdison and the system that they proposed.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Members of the commission, thank you for having me tonight to present some information about the solar project at the long-term parking lot and some background information about my company, SunEdison. So, Jeff, if...
Are we having technical difficulties?
A little bit.
Oh, it's a PDF.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Let's just go with that.
So here's an agenda. It's not going to be a long presentation. Really what I'd like to focus on is any questions that the commission may have about SunEdison or the project proposed for the long-term parking lot. So I'd like to quickly go through the goals and objectives for the city and the airport at the project, a little overview about my company, SunEdison, and then give a quick description of the project, and then open it up for questions and discussion. So by way of introduction, I'm Robin Park, as Jeff mentioned. I'm the senior manager for public sector for SunEdison in the West, focused primarily on California. And when we pulled together the solar project for the airport, we really wanted to make sure that it was in line with the objectives and goals for the city and the airport. Namely, in addition to providing clean, renewable energy, clearly there was an objective to have cost savings. And one of the things that we work with public agencies all the time on is having a hedge against future utility rate increase risk. And while none of us can predict the future, when we have looked at the past 30 to 35 years of PG&E and Southern California Edison rate information, there's been roughly a 5% annual increase in utility rates. And as you'll see when I describe the system, the PPA power purchase agreement is at a 2.5% escalator. So next slide.
Sure, sorry about that.
And roughly, we've estimated that roughly 80% of the airport's electricity usage on an annual basis will be provided by the solar canopy system. So here's just a few bullet points about Sun Edison. I won't go through them all, but I do want to highlight that we're nearly $6 billion market cap. We are the #1 solar energy services provider in the U.S. by market share. We have several hundreds of megawatts under construction, as well as several hundred megawatts that have been completed in 2014. And last but not least, I'd like to point out that we do have over 1,300 solar power plants worldwide that we own, operate, and maintain. And I'll go over our operations and maintenance system at the later point. Next slide. Finance and financial strength is key to not only successfully executing a solar project of this size and complexity, but it's also critical for the long-term operations and maintenance of the system. And so this is just an example of some of the financial institutions and relationships that we have that give us that financial strength to execute and operate systems such as the airport's solar project. We also have the most experience implementing and executing solar projects at airports and at locations that require FAA permitting. That's a picture of Denver International, one of our projects. And FAA, as I'm sure everybody is well aware, has its specific ways that it does permitting. And so we have worked with them a number of times and will have the permitting team dedicated to this project. They'll work on not only the city's permitting process, but also the FAA permitting process. And we will work closely with city staff on both of those. So here's a description. I'm sure that picture looks very familiar to most of you for the long-term parking lot. It's just under a megawatt of solar capacity. The PPA rate is 9.9 cents in year one, and as I mentioned, it will escalate at 2.5% per year. Something that I didn't put in this slide because it just recently happened, and I just discussed this with Jeff before the presentation. Southern California Edison, the Public Utilities Commission has just, I wouldn't say ordered, but has granted Southern California Edison an additional capacity for its program called Option R. And once the city applies and, should there still be capacity when the system is commissioned, that will provide additional savings above and beyond just the difference between this rate and this escalator and the current cost of power for the airport with SoCal Edison. Operations and maintenance. This is a long-term relationship. It's a 20-year term for the power purchase agreement. So the airport and the city clearly want a company that's going to be around and is going to be able to answer any maintenance issues that may come up over the term. As I mentioned before, we have over 1,300 solar power plants that we have under our management. And to manage all those systems worldwide, we have 3 renewable operations centers worldwide. One is in the Bay Area in a town called Belmont, where our headquarters is, and then one's in Madrid, Spain, and the third is in Chennai, India. And those renewable operations centers are supported by a network of support technicians in the field, and we have a number of them in Southern California. And the last point I was going to make on the operations and maintenance, kind of proof is in the pudding. When we build a system, we use a software package to estimate what we think the production will be over the course of the 20 years. And currently our portfolio is operating at 103% of those modeled estimates. And that is testament to the strength of our operations and maintenance system and minimizing downtime and maximizing performance. Last but not least, this is our proprietary client software called Client Connect, and it allows the city, the airport, really anybody with an internet connection to be able to monitor the performance of the system and look at a variety of statistics on its performance, whether it's at 15-minute intervals, weekly, monthly, annual. I think there are some fun stats in terms of number of cars taken off the road and number of trees planted as far as CO2 replacement. So with that, I'd like to open it up for any questions from members of the commission. And thank you again for allowing me to take the time to present the project to you.
I think it's important at this point for the general public to realize there's been a lot of press most recently on mirrored power transfer to steam, and this is not mirrored, and I wanted to point it out that this is not harmful to birds and or to anything. This is a totally separate system, and I think with the amount of press right now, it's important to delineate the two differences.
That's a very good point. That's it. It's what's known as solar power tower technology, and what we're using is very simple photovoltaic solar power. It's been around for many decades with powers the calculators and solar watches that you've seen over the years.
Any other questions for Robin?
Or maybe it's for either one of you. So after 20, this is for a 20-year agreement, so what happens at the end of the agreement?
Let me go through these slides, and
Okay.
I think I'll answer that question as we go along. And then we can go back to questions at the end if you want to do that. So the power purchase agreement itself, as I said, the provider is responsible for design, permitting, financing, construction, operation, and maintenance of the facility over the term of the agreement. The term of the agreement would be 20 years. And there's a predetermined price per kilowatt hour, as Robin said, each year over the term of the agreement. So SunEdison has said, we're going to generate this many kilowatt hours in year one, and they're going to cost you this many cents per kilowatt hour. And then the capacity degrades slightly over the term of the agreement, and the price inflates at 2.5% over the term of the agreement. So each year in the agreement, there's a line that says, here's how much you're going to get, here's how much it's going to cost per kilowatt hour. As far as terms, in the system itself, they'll construct the canopies in the long-term parking lot, and the airport will purchase all the electricity generated by the system. So we're responsible for purchasing all that energy. SunEdison guarantees the system will produce at least 90% of that amount that's included in the power purchase agreement. That's important because we're choosing a rate that's a time of use rate that's expensive during the day when we're expecting to offset the purchases with the solar. So if the system weren't working, we'd be paying a premium amount during the middle of the day when the system wasn't working. And then after the term of the agreement, either SunEdison removes the facility and restores the facility to its condition beforehand, or the airport can choose to purchase the system for fair market value at that time. As far as the financial analysis, as Robin said, we're expecting to produce about 80% of the terminal's electrical demand from last year. That was based on last year's billing. We're expecting to generate over 1.5 million kilowatt hours per year at a cost of, in year one, at a cost of 9.9 cents per kilowatt hour. As I said, the output and price are included in the PPA. As far as pricing versus Edison's pricing, we did a present value analysis, and we kind of set up a model within the city to do this analysis. The model assumed a 5% discount rate and a 3% inflation rate for Edison Power. So those are both variables in the model. SunEdison pricing is anticipated to beat Edison pricing by $750,000 over the term of the agreement. I think your staff report says $1.1 million. That's incorrect. It should be $750,000 to $775,000, right in that area. And that's the discounted present value. I think the dollar value that Robin gave you was the actual dollar amount that wasn't discounted. So I think looking at the final amounts before you discount, we're pretty close. So now I'm asking for your recommendation that You recommend that City Council approve and authorize the airport director to execute a power purchase agreement with SunEdison, which will allow SunEdison to develop, own, operate, and maintain a solar photovoltaic generating system at the airport and sell all power generated to the airport. So that's the recommendation we're asking for, and I'm happy to take any questions or.
Is there any guess at what fair market value might be at the end of 20 years if the airport were to purchase the generator?
Not really. The panels at this point, you know, after 20 years, their lifespan is estimated 25, something like that. So you're getting towards probably the useful life of the panels. You know, there's some value to the canopies themselves.
Question, why only 80% of last year's power was the target and that will degrade as opposed to going for more?
We choose 80% because if we should reduce our power consumption, we're on the hook to buy all the energy produced by the system. So we'd be buying power from SunEdison and giving it to Southern California Edison if we bought too much, if we made it larger potentially.
Okay.
You said giving it to Edison. I thought I recalled in the more detailed proposal that Edison actually purchases it back from us?
They would, but it's at a small, it's
Discounted.
much discounted
Okay.
rate.
So at the figures that you just showed there, we're going to be saving about $37,000 per year?
I didn't do the math as far as how many dollars per year. 20 years, 750,000 present value.
So it boils down to $37,000 per year then?
But it's net present value.
That's
So-
present value.
Right.
So actually, the estimated savings per year would be greater than 37,000 because the value of $1 in year 20 is going to
Very
rise.
true.
Right. So
That's
you
true.
see those numbers year by year go up, but taking year one net present value, Jeff's calculation showed 750.
So during construction, it would obviously have some impact on the parking in that lot. I think there was some mention that it would not be at peak times. So what do you envision the impact on parking to be during the construction?
So we're trying to get the facility to not be in construction, especially during our peak times. So that's, we're looking at, you know, November, December, Thanksgiving and Christmas type holiday season. So either before or after to be doing construction and then phase the project so we're not shutting down that entire center section of the parking lot at any one time. So we haven't discussed specifics of the phasing plan, but we have discussed it as we've gone through the process that it will be phased.
So are the canopies fairly pre-assembled, or do they, okay, so they don't require a huge amount of construction?
Right, which is probably why the 2011, I think, RFP, the original RFP, may not have garnered price competitive proposals to the airport, because at that time, the systems were essentially custom fabricated per site.
Excuse me, can you come to the
Oh,
podium?
sorry. So in 2011, most carports were still being custom fabricated to each site's specifications. And since then, there's been a tremendous amount of standardization. And so the vast majority of the prefab is going to be done off-site and then transported to site and essentially assembled. So there's not going to be welding, there's not going to be beams being bolted together on site. That all happens off-site, and they're transported to the site and then put into place.
Okay, great. Is there any net loss of parking spaces for any of the other infrastructure for it?
There will be no loss of any parking spaces. The diameter of the concrete footings sits on the intersection of the parking space lines and is, I believe, 10 inches to 12 inches in diameter. And so unless you really like to park very close to the front edge, it would not reduce the number of parking spaces, no.
All right. Does this need to go through ABR, the city's architectural board review as well?
It'll need some extensive permitting. Yes, we're in the coastal zone, so there'll be an extensive permitting process, including ABR.
And the airport staff has been very upfront with kind of giving us a heads up about that process and making sure that we account for enough time to allow for the permitting process with the city. And so we appreciate that.
And speaking of time, is there a guesstimate as to when this would go online?
Yes, our goal is to have this online commissioned by October of next year at the latest, knowing that November is the start of the busy season for the airport, and that also was made very clear to us by the staff. So that is our target, and we've been working backwards from that. And that has actually been our push to get before the commission today, and then hopefully before the council in September.
Where do the, where are the inverters going to be located?
So right now we have designed the system to use string level inverters, which actually sit at
On
the
the-
posts.
Got it.
And there are several, there are different schools of thought, but originally string inverters had higher losses and cost more on a per unit basis. And so for a system of this size 3 years ago, it would be a central inverter with a pad, which obviously takes up more space. But again, just in the last 3 or 4 years, unit costs have come down significantly for string level inverters, and the loss percentages have decreased as well. And so we're proposing to use string level inverters for the system.
And in the where the junction of the power generated by this array and the SCE input, where does that physically happen?
At the meter in the electrical room at the terminal. And thankfully, the airport had the foresight to install conduit from the long-term parking lot to the terminal, or nearly to the terminal, which is a significant cost savings and, was translated into a lower PPA rate.
That was my next question, which is, are we digging up stuff to get the cable over? And the answer is we're not.
No, where there is existing conduit, there's no need to trench or dig.
Hooray for us.
Conduit ends near the corner of Moffett and Fowler, so we will have to go across the entry, the road that enters the terminal.
But we sure did get it close.
Right.
Terrific. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, well, we have a recommendation that the Airport Commission recommend the City Council approve and authorize the airport director to execute a power purchase agreement with SunEdison.
So moved.
Second?
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, thank you. That
Thank you.
is recommended to City Council to approve the airport director to authorize.
Thank you.
Yada, 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 yada. Thanks, Jeff.
All right, thank you. And that brings us to item 9, the status report on Building 252.
Thank you, Commissioner Chair. It seems like, I probably mentioned this last time, I generally have 2 questions asked of me. One, is there any new air service in town? And the second one is what's happening with the Elephant Bar restaurant. So tonight I thought it would be appropriate for us to provide you with just an update on the marketing that's been going on and the efforts to release that property. You'll recall that the E-Bar company gave us notice last September. It's been a year coming up, that September 30th, they would vacate the premises and not renew the lease. As a side note, they subsequently went bankrupt, so we were probably fortunate to have prior notice of that. We went out for RFP to select a commercial real estate group to assist us in marketing that property, since it is sort of unique. And pretty much on the bigger side of restaurants, close to 9,000 square feet. So we did the RFP and selected Radius Group commercial brokers to assist us. And then their contract went to council in January of 2014, but they didn't start marketing right away because they had asked the airport to come along and get the property ready to be shown. And that took a little bit of effort to get it cleaned up, fixed up, and polished, so to speak. And we also did a CAD drawing on the inside to really lay out what the space was and what the dimensions were, because that had not been done and our drawings didn't provide that information. So we got that accomplished. And then in March, they started marketing the property, and they really have gone all out to do that. I've attached to your report the report they provided to us on July 17th when I asked for an update, several pages worth of information. But they've distributed the brochure to 86 companies who operate restaurants that in the square footage range that the E-Bar contains. They've also had this property listed on their website, and they've had 57,000 hits on the property or on that particular property. Marketing brochure was featured on the multiple listing service as well, and they distributed it to 1,400 real estate licensed brokers. So they really have gone all out to do that. So at the time I wrote this, we had not had any offers on the property. That's why I wrote this, just to make sure. But now, so far, we've had 2 and possibly a third proposal. So once we have those proposals in hand, we'll certainly call a meeting of the Airport Lease Review Subcommittee, sit down and share that information and get your input before we go back. So it's conceivable that we'll lease it. It does require a great deal of upgrades physically that the airport would have to invest. So once we have a complete idea of what those costs would be and what the construction items would be, we'll also share that with Commission. But at least there seems to be interest, and that's good to hear. Any questions?
Great. Well, thank you. Item 10, a preliminary fiscal year 2014 year-end financial report.
Yeah, thank you. This is very, very preliminary. The city's report to, I think that's the next line, please. The city finance department will be going to city council late September with their fourth quarter report and their preliminary on year end. So there will still be changes made to the numbers that you're going to see tonight, but this is our first blush look at that. So we'll cover our revenues and expenditures, and as always, it's subject to audit. We were below our revenue estimates this year, but not dramatically, 1.7% below. Which is interesting because we're 2.5% above 2013. So I think overall we did as well as we could with the revenues that were available. Thanks. As you know, property at the airport, the lease property is, it is the foundation for our revenue sources. And most of the land that we have available is leased. The building occupancy rate is down, but as you recall, those 2 major properties, that's the reason for that. So our revenues in commercial industrial property were 6.3% below our budget, but I think otherwise all other properties were on target. General aviation, if you'll notice, above target, above target, above target. I mean, general aviation is coming along quite nicely, I think. Operations are up, jet fuel sales are up, avgas sales are up, and the GA landing fees are up. So that's wonderful. And overall, the revenues, you'll notice, are 9.1% below, but that's because at the end of the fiscal year last year, when we were getting ready to load the budget, we were hit with a late expense. And so rather than cut, I just increased revenues, knowing that we would balance it out during the year. So that's why that particular category shows that it's under budget. These charts will just kind of illustrate operations compared to the last 3 years. So you can see in 2013 we were down, and just about each one of these, I think 2013 we were down. But this is operations. fuel sales continue to grow, which is nice to see, jet fuel. Our concessions at the gift shop, they're below target. The restaurant, on the other hand, is equally above. So folks are eating and drinking and they're not buying. I guess that's the indicator there. Rental car revenue is above target, which is really nice. Parking, as we know, has not come back as it had before, but then again, we've been way down on emplanements as well. So that's certainly understandable to me. And it's just a touch below 2013. So I think we're, and we have not had an increase in the rates, nor would I recommend that at this point either. So concession revenue at the gift shop, 2013 was a really good year for them. 2014 not as well. Same with the restaurant. So next, parking. We're just not getting there on parking. Landing fees, commercial aviation this year, the total revenue that we received for commercial aviation exceeded commercial industrial revenue. And I can't recall when that's ever happened before. So that's really, that was our goal, is to have aviation pay for itself. And so we're finally getting there. And quite frankly, it's hard to have aviation pay for itself when you have a 20,000 square foot building. You have a 60,000 square foot building and things become possible. So the landing fees are up 9.5%. Building rental is above our target because of negotiations and rates that we negotiated with the airlines. Boarding bridge fees are below target. That was because of negotiations and also just lack of use. We've had some boarding bridges out of commission, and Alaska elects generally not to use a boarding bridge. And when we made our calculations on the number of turns that would be available, we didn't factor that in initially. This year's budget we did, coming up, we did take that into account. As you can see, our passenger traffic is down. For years and years and years, we were going up at about a 2.5% increase, but it really has been falling recently. So we're down. Overall, the other revenues are above target. Interest, once again, is coming back a little bit. It's still, the city is very, very conservative in its investments, as it should be, but we are above just a little bit. TSA reimbursement, if you look at your report, is going to be higher, but that's collecting some for the prior year, and just, it all depends on when we get the agreement with TSA. Unbudgeted, that was a revenue source for reimbursing our operating fund for expenses that were incurred to take care of the rental car quick turn facility. So those that's part of the reimbursement calculation, and so we just transferred the money back over to the operating fund. Expenditures, $15,618,000. We're 6% below budget. The majority of that is in salaries and benefits, as you'll notice, 10% below. And we have vacancies just about every program, operations and patrol and administration. So we really, we're working to fill those, but we did have vacancies, and as a result, that 10% assisted us in balancing. Materials and supplies, our staff we were 5% below. And special projects, you'll recall, we have the 21% below because we stopped the use of Lot 2 in the shuttle operation, and that was beneficial. This chart gives you a listing of our actual expenses in 2013, our revised for 2014 actual, and then our variance there. So in summary, we're going to, at this point, it appears that we will tap into our reserves, policy reserves, not reserves above policy, but actual policy reserves, close to $130,000. That amount can be sort of reduced because during this fiscal year, the Goleta Water District evidently overcharged us $109,000. They discovered their error and refunded the money, but it didn't come until last week. So we can't get it back into the prior year budget. So with that, then that draws that 130 down a little bit more. And there's one other, I think that's it. So revenues were below by 1.7, expenditures below budget at 6%. That concludes my report. One question that Commissioner Miller had for me was our reserves. How much do we have in reserves, policy reserves, which were established by City Council? I don't have end of year 2014 numbers, but beginning in starting on July 1st of 2013 for this fiscal year we just completed. The airport had economic uncertainty, which is 15% of our budget, which was $2,394,734. Future years budgets, which is 10% of the operating budget, $1,596,489, and a capital budget policy reserve of $530,366 for a total of $4.5 million. So even though we're low, we have a good revenue base there as well.
I think this has been a very excellent presentation on the detail of our revenue and expenses, and certainly demonstrates a command of where our money comes from and where it goes to. And I think that there are some items that are more broad brush that we really need to be aware of. Looking at the budget as it was developed for last year, we showed $820,000 more in expenses than revenue. Looking at our actual performance, that number was only $130,000 more. That means that we did $690,000 better than what we had projected at budget time. But there's this $109,000 that's really an accounting timing error and has nothing to do with the actual operation of the airport. So if we take that out, rather than having exceeded revenue by $800,000, we only exceeded it by $21,000. So at the bottom line, we did $799,000 better this last year than what we had projected at budget time. And I think the staff is to be congratulated on that performance.
Thank you. I will certainly pass that on to them. And that dollar amount that you're mentioning, that was additional expenses for capital projects that we needed to load into the budget. So they came along, we had to fund different studies and different capital projects. So that's where that $820,000 came from. But you're right. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. And
Well,
I will
I think
share
our
with staff.
finances and operation are on very solid basis.
Thank you. Thank you.
This was also, had to accommodate the departure of American Airlines, which had a significant impact, and you rather quickly adapted to that. In retrospect now, can you make a better estimate of what the total impact of their departure was?
The most recent information I have is it's still about between $250,000 and $300,000.
Okay. And I'd asked you, and I was still a little unclear. So appropriated reserves, you had a 95K appropriated reserves, and that was basically going into reserve. Is that correct?
The city requires when you balance your budget and you have your operating expense before you do transfers out for debt service or capital, that you establish 0.5% in appropriated reserve line item. That's held there for unexpected expenditures during the year. So that's funded, but then at the end of the year, as you say, it drops to the bottom line because it doesn't carry forward. It goes into reserves at the end of the year.
Right.
If it's not spent.
So the net change was really, if you take the 130K that you would be taking out, but you back out the 95K that you're putting in anyway, it's really a net of 35K. Is that correct?
Could, yes.
Okay. You're putting in 95 and you're taking out 130.
30, right,
Okay.
right. Good point.
Okay. Anyone have any other questions? Well, again, just an excellent job at managing it and adapting
you.
to an untimely departure of American.
We're still trying to get a meeting with American. That hasn't happened yet, but I think I'll take the whole community when we go to Dallas.
Great.
Well, maybe if we show up in United, they'll look at the message.
Oh, yes. Before we move to the director's report, I see we're again fortunate to have our City of Goleta liaison here. I was just going to inquire if we could, if you had anything to share with us, we could jump back to that item.
I have nothing.
All right.
Unless you have questions you might want to ask.
All right. Thank you for joining us. The director's report.
Just briefly, passenger count, as you can tell on your statistical report, this month we were down 7.3%. Year-to-date, it's 3.4% compared to the prior year. The other item I'd like to show is you had requested fuel cells be reported, and on the back side, we do have a graph that shows that. And July was the first month where we collected for commercial airline fuel cells, that 4 cents per gallon, so that's being reflected. The Air Service consultant has completed the leakage study that we requested that they prepare so that we can use that data when we do business proposals to the airlines. And I'll be scheduling a meeting with the Air Service Subcommittee to go over that information and then ask the consultant to come and do a presentation to Airport Commission. Communications, Councilman Hotchkiss, we're doing a cup of coffee coupon, and we are distributing those periodically throughout the year, and it's been well received. We haven't actually had to pay too many for too many cups, but hopefully they'll bring it back and use it when they come back to the airport. The ARF study, the one that was commissioned through our budget last year to study the current service that we receive and any options that we could look at perhaps to reduce our cost while maintaining fire best practices. That study is in the very final editing, and a meeting has been scheduled between Airport Commission and Police and Fire Commission, a joint meeting. Is it September 24th? 6 o'clock here in our conference room. So I understand the report will be available perhaps next week or in the next 10 days. And I'll distribute it to Airport Commission and for your review before that meeting. So that's moving forward. Master plan, as you know, we had our scoping hearing. Really didn't have too many questions or input. We did receive letters from the City of Goleta and some other interested parties and stakeholders, which is what we want. And so we were pleased to receive that. And as Councilman Hodgkins said, the direct relief proposal was unanimously approved by Airport or by City Council, and the ordinance will be adopted on September 9th. And I have provided you with a copy of that staff report to Council. Other than that, that concludes my report. Any questions?
I guess I had a question on the runway 15 left, 33 right rehabilitation. That contract was awarded, and that work is expected to begin when?
As soon as, what we're waiting on now is to get our FAA grant, which I anticipate getting between now and the middle of September. And as soon as we actually have the grant in hand, then we'll issue notice to proceed. And then it would start
Early October.
early October.
Well, maybe that'll bring us a rainy season. or something,
Hopefully.
just when you get started on
Whatever it takes. We'll sprinkle the clouds.
Any other questions? All right. Well, I guess with that, we are adjourned. Thank you all for joining us.